This is the third and final part of the story about the doctor and the terrifying disease. Discover how this chilling and intense tale ends. You can find the previous episodes in the description. The next evening came quickly. To be honest, I was scared, but curiosity and the sense of purpose overpowered my fear. After all, the mission was important. We equipped ourselves with communication devices. John was responsible for coordination, and the officer was prepared for emergencies. We arrived at the same spot where I had parked my car the previous time. We went over our plan one last time, making sure every detail was covered. Then I set off on my way. I walked slowly, trying to appear calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Up ahead, I noticed a figure heading in the same direction. I quickened my pace to catch up. The man glanced at me and gave a brief nod. I returned the gesture. Without exchanging any words, we continued walking toward the cellar. The atmosphere was tense, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Halfway through the tunnel, I decided to break the silence. "Hey, I'm new here. Who should I talk to for help?" My companion didn't even turn to look at me. "You'll see for yourself," he said curtly, offering no further explanation. Exiting the tunnel, I saw that about 15 people had already gathered. No one spoke. The silence was eerie and oppressive. Not wanting to draw attention to myself, I approached an empty bed and lay down, mimicking what everyone else seemed to be doing. "Wow, this bed is rock hard," I muttered, speaking softly into the hidden microphone so John and the officer could hear what was happening. At that moment, a young boy, no older than 15, approached me. His expression was serious, almost stoic. Without saying a word, he handed me a small piece of paper. I took it and unfolded it in front of him. The paper had the number 33 written on it in bold. "What does this mean?" I asked the boy, but he didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away without a word. Maybe they take some sort of vow of silence here, I thought, trying to keep my nerves steady. I lay there for about 15 minutes. Nothing happened, and the stillness was almost unbearable. Then, suddenly, an older woman appeared from one of the side passages. Her movements were brisk and purposeful, belying her age. "Number 33, follow me," she said in a loud, commanding voice. I rose slowly from the bed, making sure to appear weak and sickly. Slouching and moving with a heavy gait, I followed the woman down a narrow hallway. She led me to a small, dimly lit room where shadows clung to the walls like a suffocating shroud. "Sit on the couch," she instructed in a calm but firm tone. I obeyed, lowering myself onto the worn seat, doing my best to mask my apprehension. "Do you already know our rules?" she asked, her voice even. "I only know that no one is allowed to speak about this place," I replied, recalling the vague instructions from my companion earlier. "That's correct," she nodded. "I understand you likely have many questions. I'll tell you what you need to know." She paused as if weighing her words, then began to explain. In 2006, the government started developing a secret biological weapon. The experiments were conducted on a sparsely populated island. Everything was progressing successfully until it wasn't. The virus escaped containment, and the entire population of the island was wiped out. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what she was saying. "How do you know all this?" I asked cautiously. She locked eyes with me before answering. "I was on that island as one of the test subjects. I developed immunity. Now I use my blood to create an antidote. Infected individuals must drain some of their blood during treatments to stimulate the production of new, clean blood." I was stunned by her revelation. What had initially seemed like a bizarre and isolated phenomenon now revealed itself as part of something much larger and more sinister. I hadn't realized just how deep this went. "We'll now give you an injection and drain a bit of your blood," the woman said calmly. I nodded. There was no other choice. I had to keep up the act. Everything she said and did was being heard by John and the officer through the hidden microphone. I could only imagine how shocked they must have been. The procedure took about 5 minutes. They injected me with something and then hooked me up to a tube to drain my blood. Lying on the bed, I tried to remain calm, though the growing unease was hard to ignore. After waiting a little while, I decided it was time to leave this horrifying place. Carefully, I disconnected the blood-draining device, stood up quietly, and made my way toward the exit. The other patients glanced at me with confusion. but no one spoke or reacted. Their silence was more unsettling than any words could have been. As I reached the exit, the officer was already there, waiting for me. Together, we quickly headed toward the car, where John was waiting. "We need to get my blood tested immediately and find out what they injected me with," I said, barely managing to keep my composure. The car ride was filled with a heavy silence. None of us dared to speak, each lost in the gravity of what we had stumbled into. The unease hung in the air, tangible and oppressive. Once at the hospital, we quickly ran the necessary blood tests. The results came back faster than expected. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The only thing I'd been injected with was saline solution. We grabbed cups of coffee and headed to John's office. The tension lingered as we sat down, and the conversation began without any formalities. "What's our next move?" John asked, looking directly at the officer. The officer crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "We can't take that woman's word for it. Her claims about the government and secret experiments, it's too far-fetched to be true," he said firmly. "True, but on the other hand, it all fits together disturbingly well," I interjected. "Either way, this is a serious issue we can't ignore." John, thoughtfully rubbing his chin, added, "We need to go back there during the day and investigate. Find out where the blood is going and what that woman is really doing." We exchanged glances, knowing full well that this wouldn't be an easy task. But first, I needed sleep. I was absolutely exhausted. These had been some of the most stressful days of my life. Yet despite my fatigue, falling asleep proved difficult. My mind wouldn't stop racing with thoughts about the woman, what they were doing with the blood, and how we could possibly treat the patient. Sometime during the night, I gave up and went outside for a smoke, hoping it would help clear my head. I knew all the cars in the neighborhood. Strangers rarely parked here. That's why the sight of an unfamiliar car in the distance immediately caught my attention. Inside the car, someone was sitting, motionless. It struck me as odd. Could it be surveillance? I wondered. I decided not to confront it right then and there. I needed to be careful. Tossing my cigarette, I returned inside and forced myself to go to bed. By morning, the car was gone, but the unease lingered. My first stop was John's house. I wanted to catch him before he left for work. "John, we need to talk," I said as soon as he opened the door. I told him about the strange car and my suspicion that we might be under surveillance. John's expression shifted to one of concern as he listened. "Do you think it's connected to the officer?" he asked, frowning. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but we need to be extremely cautious. This puts a serious question mark over who we can trust." In the afternoon, we picked up the officer and headed back to the factory. The topic of surveillance wasn't brought up. Instead, we focused solely on the immediate tasks: where to go, what to look for, and how to respond in different situations. When we reached the factory, we decided to enter from a completely different side, through the ventilation shaft. It was a more challenging route, but it ensured we'd remain unnoticed. We pried open the grating and climbed in one by one, carefully lowering ourselves into the narrow passage. "Keep your flashlights on the lowest brightness," I whispered, not wanting to draw any attention. The faint beams of light barely illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows along the walls. We moved in single file, doing our best to avoid making noise. After a few minutes, the tunnel opened up into a massive room. The ceiling loomed high above us, and the walls disappeared into the darkness. An eerie silence enveloped the space, broken only by the faint echo of our movements. "What is this place?" the officer whispered, glancing around. I brought a finger to my lips, signaling for silence, and motioned for us to keep moving forward. After crossing the massive room, we continued down the corridor. The oppressive silence seemed to amplify every step we took. A few minutes later, we noticed an open door to our left. "Should we check it out?" John whispered. We nodded and cautiously entered. Inside, there were 5 large industrial refrigerators. Even without opening them, we had a grim idea of what they might contain. Summoning my courage, I opened one of the refrigerators. Inside was a mangled body. The flesh was torn, and the limbs hung at unnatural angles. It was clear that the woman's treatment didn't work for everyone. Even though we had braced ourselves for discoveries like this, fear gripped each of us. Without opening the other refrigerators, we decided to move on. Exiting the corridor, we headed toward the main hall where patients gathered at night. I pointed to the room where I had spoken with the woman. "Over there," I whispered. We approached the door cautiously. There was no one around, which was both a relief and an unsettling sign. After a quick glance around, we stepped inside. The room was empty, just a couch, a table, and a chair. There was no sign of recent activity. "Strange," John muttered. His attention shifted to a curtain in the corner of the room. We moved closer and gently pulled it aside. Behind it was another small, hidden space. What we saw behind the curtain threw us into a state of pure horror. 4 strange bodies lay on beds. At first glance, they resembled humans, but it was clear these were not people. Tubes were connected to their bodies, but unlike the patients we had seen before, these creatures weren't being drained of blood. It was being infused into them. Above us, blood bags hung from hooks, with a slow, steady stream flowing through the tubes and into the bodies of these creatures. John moved closer to one of them and examined it carefully. "They're covered in some kind of worms," he whispered, his voice shaky. I stepped closer to take a look myself. "You're right, John," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. "It's as if these worms are weaving together, forming a single organism." The officer gagged, barely managing to hold himself together. It was clear we needed to get out of there, and fast. "Let's move," I said in a hushed tone, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. We decided to take the main exit since it was faster. Moving as silently as possible, we made our way through the dark, empty hallways. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Even the slightest noise seemed to echo endlessly. When we finally reached the car, we jumped in and sped off, heading straight for the hospital. Along the way, we dropped the officer off at the police station, agreeing to reconvene later to discuss our next steps. John and I agreed to take a one-day break. We both needed some time to process everything and regain our composure. I remembered that today was my sister's birthday, a perfect chance to distract myself. The day passed quickly, and by evening, my sister had gathered a large group of friends. For a while, I almost forgot about the recent events, losing myself in the lively conversations and laughter. But then my phone rang. It was the officer. "Where are you right now?" he asked, his voice tense. The question immediately set me on edge. "What's going on, officer?" I asked cautiously. "I'll come to you. There's something I need to tell you," he replied. I apologized to my sister, saying I needed to step out for 15 minutes, and went outside. Smoking a cigarette, I stood by the road as the officer arrived, speeding as usual. He stepped out of the car and got straight to the point. "Have you told anyone about what's happening?" "No, of course not," I replied, feeling increasingly uneasy. "Why? What's going on?" "I've been assigned to another city for an urgent mission," he began, glancing around nervously. "But here's the thing. I got word from my friends at the CIA. They've sent a lot of agents to your city on some secret assignment. Do you understand what that means?" This isn't a coincidence. A chill ran down my spine. That explains a lot. I started but stopped, trying to piece everything together. After a pause, I decided to trust the officer and told him about the suspicious car I had seen the other night. His expression darkened further. "That just confirms it," he said grimly. "This is bigger than we thought. We're all in danger." The officer and I wrapped up our brief meeting, agreeing to stay in touch and avoid making any unnecessary moves. After saying goodbye, I returned to my sister's house, where the atmosphere was carefree and lively. Laughter and joy filled the room, but deep down, I knew that after everything I'd witnessed, life would never be the same. My nerves got the better of me, and I ended up drinking too much. My sister's husband, a genuinely pleasant guy, offered to drive me home. On the way, he asked, "Hey, what's going on with you? You don't seem like yourself. Is it really that obvious that something's wrong?" I asked, trying to downplay it. "Very obvious, my friend. Tell you what, why don't we go fishing sometime? Clear your head, forget about things for a while," he suggested with a friendly grin. I agreed. It sounded like a good chance to regain some composure after everything that had happened. When we pulled up to my house, I glanced around. The suspicious car from the other night was gone, which gave me a small sense of relief. "Thanks for the ride," I said as I stepped out of the car. "Anytime, buddy. Let me know when you're ready for that fishing trip," he replied, waving as he drove off. Heading inside, I felt the weight of exhaustion fully settle in. A long, deep sleep awaited me, and for once, I welcomed it. A day later, I visited John again to check on Fred's condition. Unfortunately, there was no change. He was still in a coma. Both of us were in low spirits, struggling to make sense of everything. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was the officer. I picked up, and he wasted no time. "Stay away from that place. Don't even think about going near it. It's important. I'll explain everything once I'm back in town." With that, he hung up abruptly. John and I exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever this meant, it was clear the situation was far from over. A few hours later, we heard an explosion. The sound came from the direction of the factory, and it startled everyone. That evening, the news reported that the old factory had stored leftover chemicals that were never properly disposed of after its closure. According to the report, the chemicals detonated, but there was no danger to the town's residents. Specialists were now working on containing the aftermath. On the screen, the factory grounds were shown cordoned off with yellow tape and warning signs. People in hazmat suits were moving around the site. How convenient for the authorities. I muttered to myself, my suspicion growing. I wanted to discuss this with John, but before I could finish watching the news, my phone rang again. "Did you see the news?" John asked, his voice tense. "Yeah," I replied. "I'll come over, but first, I'll stop by the store for a bottle of whiskey. We're going to need it." Standing by the shelf of alcoholic beverages in the store, I was carefully deciding which whiskey would be best for my conversation with John. Suddenly, I heard a woman's voice behind me. "How's your health?" I turned around sharply and froze. Standing there was the same woman from the abandoned factory. "I'm fine. How about you?" I replied, trying to mask my rising anxiety with a casual tone. She gave a faint smile, her eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. "I have a lot of work to do," she said with a smirk, then turned and headed toward the self-checkout. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as she casually scanned her items, as if this encounter was just a coincidence. But I knew better. There were no coincidences in a situation like this. The finale. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Your support and feedback mean the world to us.